The exact moment my stepson raised his champagne glass and called me the woman Dad settled for after Mom died, every conversation in the engagement party died with it. 40 people stood frozen around the beautifully decorated backyard I'd spent 3 exhausting days creating. The fairy lights I hung myself still glowed overhead. The expensive catering I'd secretly upgraded because I knew his fiancée loved Italian food sat untouched on every table. Even the photographer stopped taking pictures. My husband stared at his son in horror. But just like every other time, he said nothing. My 24-year-old stepson, Mason, smirked as if he'd finally said what everyone had been thinking. "No offense, Claire." He laughed loudly enough for everyone to hear. "But no matter how long you stick around, you'll never be my real family. Mom built this family. You just married into it." A few awkward chuckles escaped from distant relatives before the silence became unbearable. I looked around the yard and realized something heartbreaking. Not a single person there knew the truth. They saw a comfortable middle-aged woman who had married a widower with 1 son. They had absolutely no idea that almost everything surrounding them existed because of me. The house, the decorations, Mason's education, the business that paid for this party, even the engagement ring sparkling on his fiancée Olivia's finger had all been possible because I'd quietly stepped in every single time this family was about to collapse. Yet for 13 years, I'd never asked for recognition because I genuinely believed love didn't keep score. I simply smiled, placed my untouched drink on the table, looked directly at my husband, Daniel, and calmly said, "Good. Then from this moment forward, you can both handle everything without me." Daniel's face lost every bit of color because, unlike everyone else standing there confused, he understood exactly what I meant. He knew there were hundreds of automatic payments, investments, trusts, emergency accounts, and financial agreements that only existed because I'd built them over the last decade. He knew I'd warned him for years that one day silence would become its own betrayal. Without another word, I picked up my purse, wished Olivia's parents a pleasant evening, ignored Mason's satisfied grin, and drove away while everyone assumed I was simply being dramatic. I wasn't. 20 minutes later, I unlocked the office of my attorney, who had managed my family's estate since my parents passed away 15 years earlier. Sitting alone beneath the dim office lamp, I stared at a thick folder labeled Family Protection Plan. It contained every tuition payment I'd made since Mason was 12, every medical bill I had quietly covered after Daniel insisted on taking the credit, every mortgage payment I'd secretly rescued during difficult years, every business loan I'd personally guaranteed when Daniel's construction company nearly failed, and every monthly transfer keeping my stepson's lifestyle afloat, without him ever suspecting where the money came from. Daniel always promised he'd tell Mason someday. Every birthday, every graduation, every Christmas. "He deserves to know what you've done," he'd whisper while thanking me with tears in his eyes. But someday never came, because Daniel couldn't bear the thought of his son discovering that another person had been carrying the family while he accepted the praise. That night, for the first time in 13 years, I stopped protecting his secret. My attorney quietly placed one document in front of me. One signature would terminate every financial safeguard attached to Daniel, Mason, and their future. I signed without hesitation. Then I drove home knowing that nothing would happen immediately. The payments would continue for another 2 weeks before disappearing one by one. Mason would assume it was a banking mistake. Daniel would desperately invent excuses. But eventually, every hidden sacrifice I'd carried in silence would vanish. And for the first time in their lives, they would discover exactly how expensive it is to insult the person who has been holding your entire world together. What none of them knew was that someone far more observant than either of them had already started asking questions. And by the time the truth surfaced, it wouldn't be me exposing the lies. It would be the woman about to marry my stepson. For nearly 3 weeks, I said nothing while the invisible foundation beneath my family's life slowly disappeared. The first call came when Mason's graduate school loan payment bounced. Daniel blamed a banking error. 2 days later, Mason's car insurance was canceled. Daniel emptied his savings account trying to fix it without revealing the truth. By the following week, their business credit line had frozen, the mortgage payment was suddenly overdue, and Daniel was working overtime while secretly applying for personal loans. Through all of it, he still refused to tell his son that the money had never been his. Instead, he let Mason believe life had simply become unlucky. The only person who noticed the pattern was Olivia. She couldn't understand how one accounting mistake had somehow affected tuition, insurance, business loans, medical reimbursements, and even the engagement venue deposit. While helping Daniel organize paperwork one evening, she found years of financial records filled with recurring transfers from an unfamiliar account carrying my initials. Curious, she quietly copied the transaction numbers and began tracing them through old statements. What she uncovered shocked her. Every financial disaster that had ever threatened the family had been solved within days by the same private account. Every expensive opportunity Mason had enjoyed had been funded by someone who was never mentioned. She confronted Daniel, expecting a simple explanation. Instead, he broke down in tears and admitted that I'd quietly financed their entire lives for over a decade while he accepted every ounce of gratitude. Olivia didn't yell. She simply asked him one devastating question. Do you realize you let your son publicly humiliate the only person who never stopped protecting him? Daniel couldn't answer. A week later, Olivia asked if she could meet me privately. I handed her a thick binder containing 13 years of receipts, canceled checks, trust agreements, tuition invoices, loan guarantees, medical bills, and legal documents. She spent nearly 2 hours reading in complete silence before finally whispering, "He doesn't deserve your kindness until he understands what he destroyed." Neither of us planned revenge, but Olivia refused to let the wedding begin with another lie. At the rehearsal dinner, attended by both families and nearly 80 guests, Daniel stood to deliver another emotional speech about the sacrifices he'd made raising Mason alone after losing his first wife. Before he finished, Olivia calmly walked to the projector everyone assumed would display engagement photos. Instead, the screen filled with scanned documents arranged year by year. Tuition payments, emergency surgeries, mortgage rescues, business bailouts, trust fund transfers. Each document carried the same signature, mine. Gasps spread through the room as everyone realized the truth. Mason stared at the screen, then at his father, whose silence confirmed everything. Finally, Olivia spoke. "Before I marry this man, everyone deserves to know who actually held this family together." Daniel admitted he had hidden the truth because he feared losing his son's respect. Mason slowly stood, but instead of defending himself, he walked across the room until he stood directly in front of me. Tears streamed down his face as he dropped to his knees in front of every guest. "I spent 13 years hating the wrong person," he said, his voice shaking. "You gave me every opportunity I ever had, and I repaid you by humiliating you in front of everyone. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn it." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Months passed before our family resembled anything healthy again. Daniel entered counseling and stopped pretending that pride was the same as strength. Mason sold his luxury truck, paid off his own debts, took a second job, and insisted on repaying every future expense himself. Every Saturday morning he began visiting my home, not asking for money or favors, but simply sharing coffee and conversation while we slowly built the relationship we should have had from the beginning. When his wedding day finally arrived 6 months later, everyone expected him to thank his late mother and his father during the reception speech. Instead, he looked directly at me before an audience of hundreds and said, "People say blood makes someone family. They're wrong. Family is the person who keeps showing up even when nobody notices they're carrying everyone else." Claire never asked me to call her mom. She never asked for applause. She just loved me when I made it almost impossible to love me back. Today I'm proud to call her the strongest parent I've ever known. I cried harder than I had the night he'd humiliated me, because this time those tears weren't born from heartbreak. They came from finally being seen. I learned something through all of it that I hope every person reading this remembers. Love doesn't need recognition to exist, but respect should never be optional. The people who quietly carry everyone else often say the least, yet when they finally stop carrying the weight, the entire world learns exactly how much they were holding all along.